Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. Welcome to any new subscribers that may have joined after seeing the recent RetroTink CE video. Thank you for your support, and I usually say this at the end, but I'll say this at the beginning now just to let everybody know. Any questions you have at all, please just ask them wherever it is you support in the latest Q&A post. The way these services work, it's kind of hard to figure out what's a question I haven't already answered yet in an older post, and as you'll see today, I like just scrolling through the different services and answering the questions as if we were hanging out somewhere at an expo or bar, coffee shop, whatever. I like the Q&As to be very laid back and chill. And if you're not a supporter, that's fine too. Just find me anywhere else on social media or YouTube comments, and I try my best to help everybody. But that's something that if I just sat there answering questions all day, I could do it 24/7 without sleeping and still not get to every question. So I try to just keep these as a thank you to all of the amazing supporters and try to help everybody else as much as I can. So anyway, let's jump in and see what we got this week. First up, on Floatplane, Dumez wants to know if Genesis 2 HD RetroVision cables will work with Colecovisions that were RGB modded. And the short answer to that is, as long as you mod it with a Genesis 2 mini DIN that's wired exactly the same, that's outputting the exact same voltages, it should work. It's certainly not going to be supported by HD RetroVision, but it should work. However, there's a lot more that you might need to know about stuff like this. So first and foremost, the HD RetroVision cables are RGB to component video converters. If you just need a generic RGB to component converter, the RGB to comp from RetroTink is probably a better idea just because it's designed for exactly this. Let's just try to take as many RGB SCART signals as possible and convert them over to component video. Whereas the Genesis HD RetroVision cables will work very well with a lot of different consoles, but they are specifically tuned for Genesis 2 and any of the consoles that have the adapters that HD RetroVision offers. Now, to move forward a little bit more, the Genesis 2's RGB output is weird, and I believe this was a cost savings. So in order to get a proper RGB SCART signal out of a Genesis 2, you need resistors and capacitors in the SCART cable itself. And I believe this was because Sega said, hey, we could save 10 cents a console by not including these components that most people are not going to use and just put those in the cable. And you think 10 cents a console, why not just spend the money? But when you have millions and millions of consoles sold, that starts to add up to a lot of money lost for a feature that most people were not going to use back then. So I may have made the same decision if I were their engineers, but that technically means that you have to improperly wire RGB output, expecting it to only work with Genesis 2 cables. And that's fine. I do that with a lot of mods. I just suggest that people always have the same output. So if you're going to use a Genesis 2 mini DIN, wire it like a Genesis 2. If you're going to use a Saturn mini DIN, wire it like a Saturn, both voltages and pinout, for this exact reason. That way you never mistakenly use the wrong cable on the wrong thing, because using a cable on a standard Genesis that was designed for something that just passes through the signals could be dangerous to your scaler. So you would have to mod it to have the exact same video signal output. Now, depending on the mod, this could be very easy. The mod itself could have options to just skip the resistor and capacitor on the RGB lines, but some don't. Some just automatically, based on the initial design, output with proper settings. So that's something that you're really going to have to dig deep into. And if you have any questions about that, I would talk to modders who have done exactly this before, because there's a lot of little gotchas. Like, for all of the right reasons, HD RetroVision cables pull sync from composite video. So you would need to make sure that even if you're not outputting composite video, it has 75 ohm terminated sync at the composite video pin. There's a lot of little things involved. Whereas if you just wire it for RGB, you use like a Saturn DIN or anything else, and then plug it into the RGB to comp, there's really not much to worry about, provided the mod was installed correctly, all that stuff. So I know this is a lot more complicated than it probably should be, but that's just the way it is in the retro gaming world. And it really is because we're trying to get these consoles to do stuff that they were never intended to do, and we're trying to shoehorn it into video standards that were really meant for video signals, not video games. So it's always going to be a struggle, but it's not too bad as long as you just take your time and you make sure you're having everything wired and connected correctly. Now, moving over to Patreon, Arkanoid wants to know, can LumaCode run through a composite video switch so that one OSSC can be used to get HDMI from multiple LumaCode modded systems? So that answer should be yes, but that depends on a couple of things. If you're talking about a mechanical push button switch, that should work totally fine because those are essentially like unplugging and replugging cables together. So that would work. You would just then want to make sure that whatever switch you're using is routed properly so you're not having any chance of interference, but that should work. Now, if you're talking about any powered active switches, it could be that they're looking for a very specific signal or signal termination on there, so that could be a problem. But if you're just talking basic composite video switches that you can get off of Amazon, I think it's absolutely worth a try, and that should work fine. Next, can the Tink 4K Morph or OSSC Pro do LumaCode? The OSSC Pro can. The Tink 4K, no RetroTink can yet. I think when more consoles start to get these mods, Mike might look into it, but he's got a lot on his plate right now, so I don't blame him if this isn't a top priority. And the Morph still doesn't take analog inputs, so we'll have to just wait until that adapter eventually releases. And lastly, what do I recommend as the best value for a 55 to 65 inch OLED 4K TV? So that's preference. My preference is whatever is the biggest sale on an LG OLED. G series if you could afford it, but C series is totally great. And I would just look for whatever's on sale. There's always tweaks between years, and the ones that are going to be coming out in a couple months, no one's reviewed yet. I always follow Vincent Teo from HDTV Test and ratings.com, and I always watch those to see if any of the new features are things that really push me over the edge to wait, or if there's any issues, like some TVs had a mild green tint at an angle for the 2024 TVs. So if you have like a living room with a bunch of different chairs and some are very askew, that might be something that you don't want to look at. So I would just do some basic research on those and pick whichever ones that you think might have the features that you're looking for. And I would only wait if there's a big deal to you, because things get delayed. I mean, it's always supposed to be spring, but very often it's not till the fall that a lot of this stuff comes out. So it's up to you if you want to wait on any of that stuff. And for me personally, I'm really interested to see if 4K 240 is going to be a thing for home TVs, which I don't want to get into that now as to why that matters for me, but there are a couple of very cool things that could be done with that. And I also am really interested to see Panasonic's new OLED TVs, which Vincent Teo just checked out, but I want to see it deep dive reviews and see how it compares to the rest. But if I had to buy a TV right now, if that OLED behind me died, I would just spend a week or two waiting to see what was the best sale on a 77-inch LG OLED C or G series. I can't afford the G, so for me it would be the C series, and hope that I'd be able to make it happen. And lastly, what about a non-OLED 4K TV for running with a Tink 4K and some PS5 or PC modern gaming? So I would always prefer to use an OLED for everything. The only exception to that rule would be with a PC that you leave your monitor on all the time, like I used to do with this one here. I do have it going to sleep mode, but still it's something that it used to be on, from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to bed at night. Now I have a multiple setup thing going on, but that's the only time I would avoid OLED, because I personally have made it I've made a point to not worry about OLED burn-in at all. And if it happens, it happens. And I've had that since 2016, and there is no burn-in. There's very often image retention, but that goes away in minutes, not hours even. So I just don't worry about it at all. However, I would for a monitor, because the Windows or Mac toolbar, you leave certain things up on your screen. You have your favorite positions to put certain programs in, so they're always viewable. That's the type of thing that you really could run into burn-in issues. So if I wasn't going to go with an OLED, I would go with the cheapest TV I could possibly find. And I do this for family members all the time. I basically just do a short bit of research as to what are the cheapest TVs available today. Then I check all the typical websites, ratings, and all the rest, and see if one of them stands out as being way worse or way better than the others. And then I just choose based on price. And I've had very, very, very good luck with that stuff. And I just think, my opinion only, this is not at all fact, but my opinion is that I would rather just wait and save my money to get a really nice OLED than try to find something in between. So, if you need something to hold you off, like let's say all OLEDs were sold out, I would go to a Goodwill or a thrift store or something and try to pick up just any cheap TV. Like, I end up doing that a lot. I've gotten a couple TVs that I leave like out in my porch and stuff that I got for $8 at a Goodwill that works perfect, 1080p, stuff like that for the short term. But, I would always save up and try to get the really good one, unless you have a very specific scenario in which OLED isn't going to work, like an extremely bright room, or of course, like I just said, PC stuff. So hopefully I pointed you in the right direction with all of that stuff. Next up, Stephen Faust said they've been using Retro Gaming Cables Pack-a-Punch SCART cables and have very little issues with them. However, using auto phase on your triple bypassed Mega Drive 2 ends up with the phase being incorrect. So they have to correct this with manual phase adjustments, but that results in a loss of brightness. That's strange. They're also getting some audio noise that they don't feel they should be getting on both the Mega Drive 2 and EDFX, which is using the same cable. So that's the plug-and-play device for PC Engine and TurboGrafx consoles that could use the same Genesis 2 cable. So my gut right off the bat, if you're telling me you're hearing some audio issues and you're having some video issues, then I would definitely try another cable, like is the point of your question here. So I'm agreeing with you in that certainly is a point of failure that you want to check. Also, when did you buy the cable? Was it 5, 6, 7 years ago, more than that? If that's the case, all of the cable manufacturers have gotten much better over time. And it's not that they were crap to start with, but I don't think any of them could have possibly known the wide variety of board revisions and issues that we found. And it's really been a decade of digging deep into this stuff to figure out how to make the best cables possible. So if you bought it a decade ago, I would just go buy another one from Retro Gaming Cables. And if you have the same issues, return it, call back, or email, whatever else. But, being in the UK, I think that would probably be the best place to start. Now, if you just bought them a month ago or something like that, I would absolutely email and check to see, could it possibly be a faulty cable? I mean, nobody's perfect, right? These things are going to happen. And just based on life, right? You never hear about the thousands of good ones. You just hear about the one or two bad ones. So it would be totally plausible that is an issue if you bought it recently. You could try to hunt down cables that are made a little bit differently. And in order to make these the best way properly, the components in the cable, like I just talked about in the ColecoVision section, need to be on the console end of things, or you do get some ringing and some other stuff. I believe Insurrection Industries have updated their cables for that. I'm not sure if the new ones have released yet. There's a bunch of other different cable makers out there, some of which are currently making cables, others are not, so it's kind of always a rough one. You could always just try to get HD RetroVision cables if your setup allows for component and RGB SCART. But if not, I don't know. I would just start with your local seller, just to, Retro Gaming Cables, just to make that easier, and just be open and honest. Like, hey, here's your other cable that I bought from you. It's giving me these issues. I'll buy another one. Or like I said, if it's been recent, maybe Rob will just send you another and see. But I would start there, and please let us know how this all works out for you, because I'm kind of curious to see, because I don't really have that issue with cables that I get the ringing when you do, a deep dive analysis, but I don't get phase issues. The one thing that does kind of bug me, which could actually be a problem with the cable itself, is you say manual phase results in a loss of brightness. If you're using the 240p test suite to do that properly, that should never be an issue. You should be able to just set the phase with the remote and just wait till there's nothing, no interference on screen. But remember that setting phase is like a clock. So if you go all the way around, it'll start back over at the front again. So it's not like you have to sit there for days trying to dial in some random frequency. Just keep spinning it around, metaphorically, until you get the best looking. But if you're still getting issues with that on two different devices, it definitely is pointing to the cable. So give that stuff a try, and please let us know. Next up, Old Kid wanted to chime in on Cam's in-wall BNC cable discussion that we've been having the past couple of weeks. And they're a CCTV integrator and have had to replace many cheap pre-made BNC cables in analog video setups due to poor connections at the termination. Their guess is that the gold plating on the center conductor tip is not real gold, causing corrosion over time, but that's just a guess. The reason they bring that up is they've had good luck with the pre-made Viper RG6 BNC cables for monoprice. A cheaper alternative would be to buy bulk RG6 and terminate yourself. Their suggestion would be Belkin RG6 and use their Belkin double bubble BNC compression terminations. If the wall is open anyways and you don't mind throwing some extra cable in there for future proofing, long runs of VGA cable could also be adapted to many different standards, and VGA is typically much cheaper for the fully shielded RGB HV lines that you could push down it. They just wanted to chime in and make some suggestions based on a little bit of their professional background in CCTV wiring. So thank you very much for that. The RG6 shielded cable through the wall is the proper way of saying what I had said last week about just using coax, like cable TV coax cable, and terminate at the ends for whatever you need. So that is certainly something that you could do. You would just have to terminate each yourself. But you could use those for RCA, for BNC. You could have that be whatever you want on each end. You just have to compensate for strain relief because that's a thick, heavy cable that you wouldn't want to go RCA directly into something. You might want to use like a pigtail adapter at the end. But that's a great suggestion. The only thing with the VGA cable, though, is you have to make sure that it's fully shielded. And this is one of these cases that, as much as I hate waste, you might want to buy one first and cut it in half and make sure that each of the lines are actually shielded. And then hopefully you could still use those cables in a hand-wired setup at some point for spares in the future. But I personally would not just throw a bunch of VGA cables in a wall and then seal the wall up unless you knew for sure that they were fully shielded, because I've absolutely seen many cables, not just VGA, be listed as shielded on the Amazon page, but they're thick cables, but if you cut them open, they're just a bunch of cheap foam with a tiny little conductor in the middle, so it's totally faking the whole shielding thing. But great advice, and thanks for sharing. Next up, Shmubby is having an issue with an EVGA XR1 Lite capture card. It still works just fine with their previous Windows 10 based laptop, but they just got a Windows 11 based one that has some really nice specs. However, it seems to have issues where the video in OBS and Discord is stuttery with crackling audio. They reflashed the firmware, they tried swapping out the HDMI cable, and while they don't have another USB cable, they've tried the same USB cable on the original laptop again, and it's still working fine. So normally, this is not my area of expertise. I did IT for a gazillion years, but I'm not up on all of the latest. However, this is a problem that I've run into before, so I might be able to at least point you in the right direction. One of the things Wendell from Level 1 Techs taught me was that if you're using USB-C, always flip it around if you have issues. Because while they're supposed to be able to be plugged in either direction, sometimes you do run into those issues. And ever since he said that, a bunch of random issues I was having stopped. I'd still have the issue, but then I'd flip the USB-C upside down, and everything would work perfectly. So that's a stupid but perfectly plausible thing to have happened. I didn't even realize that was a thing until Wendell taught me that in the interview that we did. And the other thing is, which USB port are you using? I have, without a doubt, run into computers where if you plug certain devices into certain ports, you get audio crackling, some kind of weird issues. My Motu audio interface, as well as a bunch of others. It wasn't just the Motu, it was the Focusrite, but basically there was a couple of times I ran into audio interface issues, especially when taking a USB 2.0 device and plugging it into a USB 3.0 port, which should be perfectly backward compatible, but I've got the proof that it isn't always. So different USB port, different speed USB port if you have possible, and flip the cable around on, try one end at a time, but you never know. And please report back and let us know, because I'd love to know what the actual issue is, but at the very least, I can get you started with the basic stuff that I've personally run into before, and hopefully that fixes it, but let us know. Next up, Sirtaco wants to know, is too much solder really bad for a joint, or is it just a waste of solder and equally good? And I think when you ask questions like this, you really need to concentrate on the quality of the solder joint, not so much the amount of solder. I will say that if you're talking in the context of you have a wire going through a via and you put enough solder on to cover everything, so when you're done, whatever's sticking through, whatever pin it's through, as well as the via itself, all have a good solder connection and it's nice and tight, it might look like there's not enough, but it should be totally fine. And if you added a little bit more, then that would also be totally fine. It might just be a little bit of a waste, but you're not going to hurt anything. However, if you start to bulge over, or if it starts to run through on the wire beneath or anything like that, you could cause shorts, or yes, then you could start to have a lot of issues. But this is a case where just do a visual inspection, because if it looks like it's a good connection, it most likely is. And I'm not talking about aesthetics. Yes, it's nice when things are pretty and look factory, but if you look at something and it's kind of bulgy and the colors don't really match, it could be a cold solder joint that's going to break off eventually anyway. So I think when you're talking about stuff like this, using an extra little dab of solder might be a waste of solder, but as long as it's a good connection, then it doesn't really matter. If it's not a good connection, or if it's ugly and bulging over, then that's going to cause other issues anyway. So that's what I would concentrate on. Next question, is it possible to set a wallpaper on a mister that's displayed both via HDMI and on the analog I/O board? I'm 99% sure this is possible. You just have to enable certain settings in the Mr. INI file. And I think this is a case where you would add an extra setting to the bottom of the Mr. INI. So what you could do is you could actually set up completely different video mode settings for the menu as you could for the actual cores. So then when the cores load up, you're back to ultra low latency, perfect video modes for analog, just, the one-to-one video modes. But having a highly buffered, very laggy menu is actually pretty beneficial sometimes, because it'll allow you to have that extra buffer in there to do things like run update all, have wallpapers. So I would just check out the GitHub and the wiki for stuff like that. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly how to do it, but I do know I have at least one of my misters set up that way, because I really like Ronnie Snice's wallpapers. I have those all enabled. They're all free. You just enable them in update all. I'd set it to both for this exact scenario, so you have it for your flat panel and your CRT. And I really, really like those. So it's definitely possible. I'm just forgetting exactly what to do, but I'm pretty sure it's settings in the Mr. INI. So that should be something that you could track down. And if anybody knows off the top of their head, please post in the comments and I'll pin the comment, update the description, whatever else. Next up, Christopher Skurick wants to know if I could do a quality comparison between analog and digital audio via Toslink on Mister. They usually direct connect their Mister to their amplifiers, but they were wondering if you could have a good upgrade if you use an external DAC like their SMSL DAC or the Shit Audio. That's actually the brand. So I do have some opinions on this. First, the more modern Mister kits that are being sold have good audio amplifiers in them, except they're supposed to be audio amplifiers that compare to the original consoles. These are not audiophile grade DACs. So I would almost guarantee that if you are somebody who's invested in a good DAC and a good stereo, you will hear a difference going from digital to your stereo that way. I think you would probably prefer the sound, and I think it's something that is a worthy upgrade, especially if you already have, if basically all you need to do is get the mini Toslink to regular cable and use your DAC there. That's a perfectly good investment. Now, if you're somebody that doesn't already own all of this stuff and you're perfectly fine with how original consoles sound, then I would say if you have a newer Mr. kit, it's probably perfect. It's probably exactly the same as the originals, and you're going to get a high quality analog sound off of it. But if you have a much older kit that's using the not as good audio circuits, or if you have an issue with yours, then, like if you're getting a weird audio buzz, but everything else is working perfect, and you already have a stereo, yeah, look into DAC support or look into a stereo that has optical audio inputs and kind of go from there. I have a halfway in between setup on mine. I have an NAD amp that has digital inputs in it. And I'm sure if I went out and hunted down some amazing, multi-$1,000 digital to analog converter, I can get better sound that way. But I use the digital audio out of my Mister to go directly into my amp and let it do the digital to analog conversion. And it does a very good job. It's not a cheap amp. It's not an expensive amp, especially if you put it in the context of audiophile stuff. But it's not some bargain amp. It's a decent NAD amp. And it's certainly the most expensive amp I've ever owned, because I've never really had the budget for good stuff. And I'm more than happy with how that sounds. Now, to do a quality comparison would be unfair, because I would have to go back and do IO kits that aren't even really sold anymore in order to really show the difference. So I think if I were to do a video like that, I would have to do something like use only the newest kits that are being sold. But then what DACs would I use? Would I go and get a $200 shit audio DAC? Would I get an SMSL? Do I go down to places that I've kind of known over the years and go put it through a $2,000 DAC? And then how are you going to hear the difference? Are you going to have good quality headphones, or are people just going to be listening to their cell phone on a table somewhere? So it's much harder to do this kind of analysis with audio than it is with video. So I don't think a video, or any kind of comparison that I could do would do it justice for audio. I think MD Fourier analysis might be fun, but even then, when you're talking about digital to analog converters, a lot of times the way the conversion's done changes the sound a little bit. And if your ears prefer that, it's a win, but MD Fourier is just going to see that as you've changed the sound. So I think this less than 5-minute answer I have for you here is probably as good as I'm going to go with this. But I do think it would at least point you and others in the right direction, because don't forget, it's very easy to obsess over audio. So you want to make sure that you're solving problems or just utilizing equipment you already own. So even if it wasn't a problem, if you already own all this awesome stuff, I would definitely use it, because why not, right? Next up, Adam Ant has original component video cables for the Wii, but when they use it with the Tink 5X, it keeps dropping and regaining signals. They tried HD Retrovision's Wii cables, and it works like a champ. Is there any reason to try and keep the original component cables to possibly fix, or are they trash? So if they're not official Nintendo cables, if they're third party, probably just throw them out or cut them up and use them for parts. And I would really, in your mind, just consider it as trash, because I've done infinite amounts of tests with those crappy third-party cables, and they're never good. And the rare ones that are, they shouldn't be breaking like this anyway. So if it's a non-Nintendo branded cable, maybe snip the Wii side of things off in case you ever need a Wii console plug connector, and toss the rest. If it is a Nintendo branded cable, here's where I might experiment. Maybe at the end of the cables where the RCA connectors are, cut those off and cut them off, at least an extra inch worth of cable, and then re-strip the ends and add new RCA connectors, especially if you happen to have any laying around in your parts bin, just to test out and see if it drops signal. If it doesn't, that means just the RCA cables wore down over time on the connector side of things, which 20 years old, so not unfair to have that happen. But now you have yourself a spare set of Wii component cables that you could rely on. And if that doesn't work, and you still drop signal, cut the console end off and, try to just the same as if they were the third-party cables. Use that in case you ever need something to tinker with. But, the HD Retrovision cables really are top-tier, high-quality cables. I don't have affiliate links on all stores, and I certainly don't when I just tell you go buy them. So it's one of those recommendations that I truly, truly stand by. And even if I wasn't friends with Nick and Steve, and even if they, turned into my enemies and called me poopy heads or whatever, I still would recommend these things all day long. They're that good. So you made the right choice by buying those. But who knows? Maybe your original cables can be used as spares. Maybe it's just a worn down thing. But I wouldn't spend too much time on it, especially if it's a third-party cable, because you have a perfectly good solution now, and maybe it's not worth all the extra hassle. Up to you, though. Next up, Tony Escobar is having an issue with the latest firmware for the Everdrive N8 Pro when used on their Analog Mini NT Noir. The games either won't launch or will crash, but when Tony downgrades back to version 2.15, everything works fine. So I think there's a couple of troubleshooting steps you need to go through, but I think this could be an easy fix. First, do you have any other NES console to test this on, or only the analog? If you do, then that's obviously an easy one to try just to see if it's a compatibility issue with that. But how did you update to the latest? Did you select the EFU file the same way I showed? I'll link to the Mega Everdrive Pro update, because that one should be the same process, where basically you update to the second latest firmware, scroll down to the EFU update file, and launch it as if you were going to launch any Nintendo game, but then it's going to say install firmware. It'll give you like a menu choice. and then you install it that way, wait for it to reboot, and then you should be on the latest firmware. If you went through that process and you're still having these issues, then it could be a problem with the FPGA-based consoles, so you might want to hit up Crix on his forum or social media or something. But if you haven't upgraded that way, that would be the issue. And I probably need to update my post because I wasn't sure if I had talked about the EFU update. I know I mentioned the save game file, but if that was the case, then I apologize, my bad, and I'll go update the post right now. But try that and see what happens, and maybe just follow up and let us know, because that's something where if there is an issue with the Analog Mini, then I would want to let Crix know because it should be an easy fix. Obviously, if it was working perfectly on a previous firmware, then you don't have to worry, but it's something that might need a tweak or two. I don't really know, but do that and see what you think. And if I screwed up the post, my bad, and I appreciate the heads up. One more question from Tony. He wants to know if HDMI mods for GameCube will work via a DAC to get RGB output. And the answer is yes, but there's some stuff that you need to know. So it doesn't matter if you're using an internal HDMI mod like the Pluto or an external plug and play like the Carby. All you would really need is an HDMI to VGA converter, a cheap DAC, and then the HD15 to SCART, or any kind of sync combining circuit that will get you RGBS. If you have a SCART setup, the HD15 to SCART's the way to go anyway. If you have any other setup, you could just adapt it that way. But there are a few problems with this. First of all, if you set it to 480p, will your system accept 480p over SCART? If you're talking about scalers like the OSSC, the RetroTinks, then yes, absolutely. Everything except the 2x SCART would work. That's the only one that takes 480i and 240p only. The 5x CE and Pro, as well as the OSSCs, and those should all be able to work perfectly. The other problem is, what if you're going to games that are 480i or 240p, 15 kilohertz? Some DACs just don't work with that anymore at all. And this is a big deal if you're going into something like a PVM, which only accepts 15 kilohertz. Not all of them do. I just mean if you're going into one that only accepts 15 kilohertz, then you might have a problem with the DAC itself. So what I would suggest is getting the cheapest one out there and an HD15 to SCART. The ones that I linked, that Tony also linked to in the question, thanks Tony, I think you could get them for $8. And while I really hate waste, and I especially hate wasting anybody else's money, I am very confident telling you, go buy this $8 thing, and if it doesn't work, you're probably going to use it again. Because at $8, if you use it 3 or 4 more times in your life, you've won. So that's one of the rare moments where I definitely am like, just buy it and see what happens. The HD15 to SCART's a little more expensive, and if it's something that you think you might work with, you might use with other things, definitely pick it up. But that's a little more, do you want to drop the money on something like that? But hopefully everything will work out. And if you're really just looking for 480p, that should all work totally fine. So I think I'll just leave a link to the HD15 to SCARTs. I think the latest post I did shows the Europe seller, but it also has the links to everybody. So I'll drop that in the description just so everybody around the world could pick one up if they need to. Next up, Heinrich has a PAL Dreamcast with a DC HDMI and a mode installed. They just got a CRT and they're looking to connect it with an analog cable, but they found out there's a number of Dreamcast games which are not compatible with RGB. So can this be remedied via an ISO patch, or should they just get an S-Video cable? So because you gave enough info in your question, I'm going to answer it for you first and for everybody else second. The fact that you have a mode means adding a patched ISO is super easy, and either all of them or almost all of the games that have RGB issues can be patched. So I would do that because now you're going to get the highest quality analog video signal for your CRT, and you could go from there. If you had said, I have a disk drive and I really just want to use my original discs, I would say find an S-Video cable, and it's close enough to RGB so that when you're playing on a CRT, it's fine. And that way you just don't even have to worry about it. But the fact that you have a mode, that I would just use RGB and go from there. One thing that you should note though, with your DC HDMI, plugging in a 15 kilohertz only cable, so essentially not a VGA cable, will, if I remember correctly, that will force that into deinterlacing 480i stuff. So you can't have it rendered in 480p on the DC HDMI and have it 480i via the cable. So the SCART cable, or S-Video too, of course. So I would just leave the analog video cable unplugged unless you're playing on the CRT. You could still do both at the same time. You could still stream with it. Just note that the video quality output is not going to be as good, and it has nothing to do with the DC HDMI. That's just the way that the Dreamcast itself works. So, unless you have an incredibly rare CRT that could support 480p over SCART, I don't even know if that was a thing, to be honest with you. But for the most part, you probably just have a standard definition consumer CRT, and it still is going to look amazing with Dreamcast, but you just want to keep that in mind. So I would also set your DC HDMI to cable detect so you don't have to worry about forcing video modes and then wondering why your CRT doesn't work sometimes. I would just set it to cable to detect and then leave the console end of the cable unplugged for until you're using RGB, and that should take care of everything for you. If anybody has any thoughts on the Dreamcast patches and stuff, maybe I'm missing something, but I'm pretty sure there wasn't much of a problem anymore as long as you have the ability to patch ISOs. But let me know if I forgot anything. Next up, Fred Rummig said the launch of the new Neo Geo flash cart has got them thinking they want to add a Neo Geo to their retro setup. They really don't have any knowledge of the systems themselves, and most of their Neo Geo experience is from ports to other consoles and emulation. If they have nothing, what version of the console should they be looking for? They're plugging this into a consumer CRT via component video. So the first thing I'm going to have to say is if you're going to component video, you're most likely going to be looking for an HD RetroVision cable solution. So you would need to have a console that could output something like that. The other thing I need to mention is that that new flash cart is only for MVS arcade boards. So it should run fine on AES home consoles. You would just need to get an MVS to AES converter. Vertex is the best, but it's often hard to get. So that's something that you would have to hunt down. Next is, do you need composite video support? If so, then going with an original AES, which is going to be costly, but if you like original hardware and you want something like this, it's a very cool solution. But you would want to get an AES, the HD RetroVision cables, the HD RetroVision Neo Geo adapter, that's cheap. You'd want to get the MVS to AES adapter and get that ROM cart. And that's a lot to buy, but you'd have a pretty good setup, and that would also allow you to play both AES and MVS games. AES games come in those really cool looking cases, but a lot of them are far more expensive than the MVS versions, even though it's essentially the same game. So that having that converter would allow you to have original games as well, including the cheaper MVS versions for some, and use that newer ROM cart. So that really opens up a wide variety of options for you in case you ever get a different CRT with composite. But it sounds like for your setup, what you're going to want is the OpenMVS, which is going to be a bit of work. You'd want to hunt down an MV1C arcade board, which are small and compact, but everything kind of built in. And then you could get the OpenMVS kit, which outputs a Genesis 2 RGB signal. Not composite video, only RGB, but then you just get HD RetroVision Genesis 2 cables and you're all set. You have component video, you have an MVS with a high quality output. You could use that ROM cart, just the ROM cart itself. And the OpenMVS definitely looks and feels like an AES. Not exactly, but people who are into retro games could look at it and know what it is pretty quickly versus, some of the other kits that are out there. So I know that's not at all an easy answer and certainly probably not what you were hoping for, but it is a solution all around. So I'll leave a link to the OpenMVS project and hopefully that could point you in the right direction. That does also have an HDMI kit available as well, but if you're playing everything through a CRT, which Neo Geo looks amazing on a CRT, you might want to just get the analog version, which is obviously going to be much cheaper than the HDMI board. But, when I answer these questions, I want to answer the person who asks directly, but I also am aware that other people are listening. So there's probably somebody else, Fred, that hears your question and goes, I kind of want to do this too, but I need composite video, or I'm just going to HDMI. So I wanted to add those little extra things in there as well. But I think I probably got you pointed in the right direction. So I'll leave a link to that. Well, that's it for this week. I already gave my usual outro speech at the beginning, so I'll just say thank you to everybody who participates, thanks to everybody who listens, and especially thank you to anybody who supports in any way, because it really is you who's keeping all this going. So thanks very much, and I'll see you next week.